Welcome to part 7 of my guide to video game history. The year is 1982, and it proves an important year for home gaming, with not one but 3 classic computers being released. The story begins with Chris Curry, an employee of Sinclair since 1966. In 1978, he leaves Sinclair to set up his own company with Herman Hauser called Acorn. In 1980, they've released their first kit PC called the Acorn Atom, which was a strong competitor of the ZX80 by Sinclair. In 1981, the BBC British Broadcasting Corporation was planning to do a 10-part series to improve computer literacy of its viewers, and they wanted a PC to use in the show to illustrate it. Obviously, the machine had to be British, and it was between Sinclair and Acorn on who they would choose. The new machine Acorn were working on was called the Proton. Impressed, the BBC selected it for their series. This meant that not only Acorn would get the prestigious BBC name on their product, but they would also get a series that would be like one long advert for their new machine. The Proton was renamed the BBC Micro computer, and it was released in November 1981 for £299 and £399 for the 16K and 32K models. Demand was massive, with the British government selecting it as the PC of choice for all its schools in the UK. With many UK game designers of today's first experience of using a computer was with a BBC Micro and its fantastic BBC Basic. Notable games released for the BBC was Repton in 1985, a Boulder Dash clone, and one of the truly groundbreaking games of all time, Elite, by David Braben and Ian Bell, released in 1984. This massively in-depth space adventure that fitted a whole universe into a 32K machine. The game was a marvel, allowing total freedom to do whatever you want within the game. Also there was Revs by Jeff Cremond, a fantastic racing game that was one of the first games that allowed you to be sat in the car. The other big machine released in 1982 was the ZX Spectrum by Sinclair, which offered 8 colours and high-resolution graphics for the time. All this, and Sinclair had done it again, with it only costing £125 for the 16K model and £175 for the 48K model. And these prices would drop in 1983 down to £99 and £129. The machine was a wonder of design, being tiny in size and only having 40 rubber keys as opposed to the typical 60 to reduce costs. It went on to be a huge success, with the cheap price making it the most popular home PC in the UK. It was the Spectrum that would turn out countless bedroom programmers in the UK, making it one of the most prolific game developers around today. Notable games released on the Spectrum were Hungry Horace by Melbourne House, a Pac-Man clone that was successful enough to spawn 2 sequels. There was Horace Goes Skiing, a mixture of Frogger and a simple skiing game, and Horace and the Spiders, a compelling platform game. Melbourne House and Beam Software also released The Hobbit, a text adventure with graphics based on Tolkien's book. Kevin Toms released Football Manager, one of the first games of this type that let you take your football team to the top of the league. There was Scuba Dive by Durrell Software, and also Manic Miner by Matthew Smith, who, inspired by Miner 24-9er on the VIC-20, would write his own surreal take on the platform game, packed full of imagination and humour. He would follow this up with the even weirder Jet Set Willy, another great platform game. Also there was a brilliant game called Chucky Egg by Nigel Alderton, who at just 16 or 17 wrote the game in his summer holidays. In the game you played Henhouse Harry, who must collect up all the eggs while avoiding the birds. The game would be published by A&F Software and would go on to sell 1 million copies. Also, in 1983, Sandy White released Ant Attack, a great 3D isometric game which had you running around a city to rescue your trapped loved one from giant killer ants. Interestingly, the game allowed you to choose whether you were a boy or a girl, being the first game of its type to allow you to choose this. But in 1983 the developer on everyone's lips was Ultimate Play the Game, set up by two brothers, Tim and Chris Stamper, who, from the first game, Jetpack, a great shooter, would produce hit after hit. In 1983 alone, they released Cookie, Trans Am, Luma Jetman, and the brilliant Attic Attack, which was a frantic overhead shooter which had you explore a huge castle. In 1984, you would see the brothers do it again with Saberwolf games. Saberwolf was an event set in a jungle, but then came Saberwolf's second game called Nightlaw. This had the game shown isometrically and had you solve puzzles and explore to survive. The game was groundbreaking, but after 1984, Ultimate seemed to lose their drive to make games, with follow-up games seemingly just clones of Nightlaw. So had the Stamper brothers lost interest in writing games? Not a bit of it. It's just their focus has switched to a new machine they had picked up from Japan called the Famicom by Nintendo, and knowing that this would be the future, they'd started to learn how to code games for the machine. So in 1986 they finally sold Ultimate Play the Game to US Gold and set up their new firm called Rare. With Rare they would concentrate on making just NES games. Rare became one of the most prestigious developers for Nintendo, creating a string of classics such as Donkey Kong Country, Banjo-Kazooie and GoldenEye, to name but a few. 1982 also saw the release of our third major machine, called the Commodore 64. After the surprise massive demand of the VIC-20, Jack Tramiel, who was head of Commodore, decided to reassign chips they had been working on for the arcades into the home computer market. The C64 was a beautiful machine that had 16-colour graphics and the great SID sound chip, which meant for the time it outstripped all its rivals, especially in the game-playing arena. The machine was a resounding success, particularly in the US, where it outsold Atari's 400 and 800 home computer. In the UK, however, although it sold reasonably well, at £200 it meant that most people instead opted for the Spectrum, which was half its price. Great games produced on the Commodore 64's early years would be the wonderfully bizarre Attack of the Mutant Camels by Jeff Minter. This he would follow up with Grid Runner and The Matrix. There was Amiga Race, an enjoyable blaster, a wonderful Beachhead, a compelling shooter, and there was Castle Wolfenstein, a great game that so frightened a young John Romero that it would inspire him to make a pseudo-sequel years later when he created Wolfenstein 3D. There was International Soccer, a hugely playable soccer game that you could play from the side viewpoint. And there was Bruce Lee, a great beat-em-up platformer. Also, Trip Hawkins at Electronic Arts released their first licensed sports game called One-on-One Julius Erving and Larry Bird, which was an enjoyable basketball game and sold by the bucket load thanks to the licensing deal. Electronic Arts would learn from this and position itself as a lead publisher on licensed sports games. On the 11th of April 1994, a fourth contender stepped into the room, called Amstrad CPC 464, and it was run by Amstrad's Alan Sugar, better known today as the UK boss in The Apprentice show. But in 1984, the Amstrad Colour Personal Computer 464 was released. To help play catch-up with the Spectrum and Commodore 64's massive game library, Amstrad also set up its own publishing firm called Amsoft, and would create some early classics, such as Roland on the Ropes, Oh Mummy, Harrier Attack, and Galactic Plague. The problem was that third-party support for the machine was often seen as a footnote for, and often they would do straight ports of the Spectrum. But when a programmer did utilise the Amstrad hardware, the machine started to show its worth. It was a real winner. Amstrad would prove very popular in Europe, particularly in France. Well, thanks for listening to part 7, and please listen out for part 8, where we discuss the video game market crash of 1983 and 1984.